The burned wreck sat at the far end of the auction lot like something the desert had already tried to swallow. Caleb Hunter saw it the moment he stepped out of his truck, Lila's small hand in his, and he felt the strangest thing move through him. Not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. The kind that hits you somewhere behind the sternum before your brain has time to argue. Every dealer in the lot had already walked past it, some of them laughing. A few had taken pictures to send to people back home, the kind you caption, "Look what counts as a Ferrari in Nevada." Caleb stood in the dry morning heat and stared at the ruin, and the ruin stared back. And somewhere in the collapsed chassis and the fire-scorched body panels, something answered. Like the video. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see where our listeners are coming from. The auction was held on a Saturday, which was the only day Caleb could afford to be away from the garage without losing a customer. He'd loaded Lila into the truck at 5 in the morning, stopping for gas station coffee for himself and a chocolate milk she didn't finish, and driven 3 hours east into the kind of Nevada landscape that made you feel like the world had given up decorating. Flat brown ground, pale sky. Power lines following the highway like they had nothing better to do. Lila slept most of the way with her head against the window, her dark hair fanned across the glass, her breathing steady and slow in the way that always made him watch her longer than he should while driving. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's jaw and her mother's habit of going quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She'd been doing a lot of that lately. "We're here," he said when he turned off the highway onto the unmarked access road, the truck rattling over cracked asphalt. She opened her eyes without drama, the way kids do when they've been half awake for miles. "Is it good stuff?" "Probably not," he said. "Then why are we here?" "Because sometimes the stuff nobody thinks is good turns out to be the best stuff." She considered this with the seriousness she gave most things he told her, then looked out at the salvage yard materializing through the dust, row after row of vehicles in varying states of collapse, and said, "It looks like a car graveyard." "It kind of is. That's sad." "Depends on who's doing the burying," Caleb said, and pulled into the lot. He'd been coming to salvage auctions since he was 19 years old, first with his uncle, then alone, then eventually as someone dealers recognized by face, if not always by name. He wasn't a collector. He didn't have the money for that, hadn't had it in years. He came because occasionally, not often, maybe once in a run of 20 or 30 auctions, something showed up that the price tags didn't account for. A detail in the bodywork, a casting mark on a bracket, the particular geometry of a suspension mount that told a story the documentation didn't bother with. He had a talent for reading those things. He'd been told so once by someone who mattered, and then later by the same person. He'd been told other things that mattered more, and none of them were compliments. That was a long time ago. He didn't let himself think about it much. The lot that Saturday held maybe 40 vehicles, salvage titles, insurance write-offs, a few estate liquidations. There was a cluster of old American muscle near the entrance, the kind of cars that drew a crowd of men in their 50s who spent 15 minutes debating horsepower figures and then bought nothing. There were 2 European sedans that had been in floods, their interiors still carrying the particular gray residue that floodwater leaves when it recedes. There was a Porsche from the 90s that had rolled and been straightened badly, the kind of repair you could see across the lot if you knew how to look. Caleb moved through the rows with Lila beside him, her hand sometimes in his and sometimes not, drifting toward things that caught her eye. The curve of a fender, the cracked leather of a bucket seat exposed by a missing door. She had his instinct for shapes, or maybe she'd just absorbed it the way kids absorb whatever their parents find interesting. He'd never pushed it on her. But she noticed things. The burned car was at the far end, separated from everything else by about 20 feet of empty gravel, as if the other vehicles had moved away from it during the night. Caleb saw it from 3 rows over and felt his stride change. He didn't stop walking. He just angled, gradually, in that direction, the way you move when you don't want anyone to see where you're going. It had been a fire, and a bad one, the kind that got into everything, the kind that doesn't leave cleanly. The body panels that remained were warped and blistered, their paint long gone, the underlying composite scorched to a chalky gray black. The windshield was gone entirely, the frame where it had sat twisted outward in a way that suggested heat from inside the cabin rather than outside. Both front quarter panels were buckled. The rear section had collapsed partially inward, the bodywork pressing against what remained of the mechanical components in back. What remained? Caleb crouched beside the rear quarter and looked at what the fire had missed. It hadn't missed much, but what it had left was enough. The mounting geometry of the rear subframe, what remained of it, had a particular triangulated configuration he had seen exactly once before in his life. In engineering drawings he'd spent 18 months working on in a building he was no longer allowed to enter. The casting on the remaining suspension upright had a profile that no production car had ever used, because the production car had never come. The inboard rear brake setup, mostly destroyed but the mounting provisions for it still present in the surviving metalwork, was a solution to a problem that only existed in a very specific performance envelope, one that required a specific engine layout to create in the first place. He stood up slowly. His mouth was dry. "Daddy?" Lila said beside him. "Yeah." "What is it?" He looked at the burned wreck for a long moment. "I'm not sure yet," he said, which was not entirely true. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Pete Garwood, who had run this lot for years, and who treated every vehicle with the same flat professionalism, regardless of what it was, which Caleb had always respected. He'd bought things from Pete before. Pete remembered him. "You're not looking at that thing," Pete said when Caleb found him near the registration table. "What can you tell me about it?" Pete looked at him. "I can tell you it came out of an estate in California. Old man collected cars, died last spring, family didn't know what they had, and didn't care. Most of the collection was normal stuff. We sold that separately. This one nobody could identify. No title, no VIN we could trace. Fire damage was apparently pre-existing, happened a long time ago, wherever it came from before the old man got it." "How long ago?" "A state attorney said the collector acquired it in the late 90s. That's all they had." "Any documentation?" "Nothing. No paperwork, no history. It's selling as is, title absent, no representation of what it is or was." Pete paused. "Caleb, I've had 3 dealers look at it this morning, and all 3 of them said it's a rebodied kit car that somebody burned trying to make it look exotic. One of them said it's not even worth the metal." "What do you think?" Pete was quiet for a moment. "I think I've been doing this a long time, and I don't know what that is, and I've stopped saying that means it's worthless." He said it carefully, the way a man says something he doesn't want repeated. "What's the floor?" "I'm starting it at 300. I'd be surprised if it sees 4. Caleb looked back across the lot toward the burned shape at the end of the row. From here, it was just a dark smear against the pale gravel, ugly and collapsed and easy to walk past. He'd been walking past things his whole life, and then one morning he'd stopped and paid attention, and it had cost him everything. He'd spent years since then learning to be more careful about where he put his attention. He wasn't sure this was careful. "I'll be there," he said. The bidding drew 6 people, which was generous. 2 of them were there out of morbid curiosity and dropped out before Pete finished the opening description. A dealer from outside Phoenix named Roy Castillo, who Caleb had crossed paths with before and didn't like, stood with his arms folded and a smirk arranged on his face and said loudly, to nobody in particular, "I'll give you $50 for the scrap weight." 2 other men from a shop in Las Vegas laughed at this. One of them took a photo. Pete opened at 300. Caleb raised his hand. Roy Castillo looked at him. "You serious?" Caleb didn't answer. 300, Pete said. Do I hear 350? Nobody moved. "Going at 300, Pete said. Once, twice. 350, Roy Castillo said, not because he wanted the car, but because he'd decided Caleb shouldn't have it. Caleb raised his hand. 400. Roy looked at him for a moment with something between amusement and irritation. Then he shrugged, the universal gesture of a man deciding the joke wasn't worth the money, and stepped back. 400 once. 400 twice. Sold. Lila was standing next to Caleb, and she looked up at him. "We bought the burned car," she said. "We did. Is that a good thing?" He looked at the wreck across the lot, at the collapsed bodywork and the scorched composite and the geometry underneath that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist, that had only ever existed in one place in the world at one specific moment in his life before everything went wrong. "I think so," he said. I'm not certain yet. It took 2 hours to load the wreck onto the flatbed trailer he'd rented, because what remained of the car's structure was unstable, and he didn't want to stress it further. He worked carefully, with the deliberateness he'd developed over years of handling things other people had given up on. Lila sat on the wheel well of his truck and watched him, eating a granola bar she'd found in her jacket pocket, asking questions he answered in pieces. What kind of car is it? I'm not sure what it was called, but you know what it is. He looked at her. She was 9, but she'd been watching him work since she was old enough to be in the garage, and she'd learned early that he was precise with language in ways most adults weren't, that he chose words carefully, and that when he was imprecise, it was on purpose. I think I know, he said. I need to look at it more carefully. At home? At the garage. She nodded, satisfied with this, and finished her granola bar. The drive back was quieter than the drive out. Lila fell asleep again around mile 40, and Caleb drove with one hand on the wheel and the Nevada desert opening up around him, and his mind moving through what he knew and what he suspected and what it would mean if the thing on the trailer behind him was what he thought it was. In the mid-90s, he had been 26 years old and employed by a small advanced engineering division attached to a larger automotive company whose name he had eventually been legally discouraged from saying in public. The division had fewer than 30 people, all of them chosen for a specific combination of technical ability and willingness to work in conditions of near-total secrecy. They were building something that didn't exist in any public record, a test platform for a propulsion and chassis concept that was, if the math held up, somewhere between 10 and 15 years ahead of what anyone was putting into production. The project ran for 3 years. Caleb was the youngest engineer on the team and the one who'd designed the rear suspension geometry, the particular triangulated configuration that had no published precedent because it solved a problem specific to the project's power delivery characteristics. It was the best work of his life. He'd known it while he was doing it, which was a rare thing. In the 3rd year, when the test prototype was nearly complete, something happened. He'd never gotten the full story and probably never would. What he knew was that the project was shut down without warning, the team was dispersed, the prototype was declared destroyed, and the engineering records were sealed. He also knew, because he'd been told so in a meeting that ended his career, that the design had been misattributed in internal documentation, his name removed and replaced with that of someone more senior who had contributed almost nothing to the technical work. When he objected, the legal process that followed had been efficient and thorough. He lost. He'd spent the years since then working with his hands, doing the thing he was actually good at without the titles or the recognition, keeping his head down and raising his daughter and trying not to think too much about what had been taken from him. The prototype had been declared destroyed. He thought about the casting mark on the upright, the inboard brake provisions, the triangulated subframe geometry. Nothing about that car was production. Nothing about it existed anywhere in the world except in his memory and in the work he'd done before someone else put their name on it. The trailer rattled behind him on the highway, and inside the burned shell on the flatbed, the machine that wasn't supposed to exist traveled through the desert in the afternoon light. Caleb's garage sat at the edge of Ridgemont, a small city in the central Nevada basin that wasn't exactly dying but wasn't thriving either. The shop had 2 bays, a small office with a window that looked out at the parking lot, and a back area where he kept his tools and the few personal projects he'd managed over the years. He rented the building month to month from a landlord who was patient about late payments when they happened, which was more often than Caleb liked to acknowledge. The business was called Hunter Automotive, which had sounded more impressive when he'd named it than it did now. He did good work and his customers knew it, which meant he had enough to get by and not much more. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to pay for Lila's school and her medications and her quarterly appointments with the cardiologist in Reno, the visits that always lasted longer than the paperwork suggested they would because the doctors had questions that took time to ask carefully. Lila's heart had a structural abnormality, a defect in one of the valves that she'd been born with that her mother had not lived long enough to know the full prognosis of. The condition was manageable with medication and careful monitoring, and the cardiologist in Reno had been clear and consistent in her assessment. The medication was holding it stable, but stable wasn't fixed. There was a surgical procedure, a specific and expensive one that would correct the defect permanently. The cardiologist had been equally clear about that. It wasn't urgent yet, but the window in which it was most safely performed was not unlimited. Caleb thought about money the way people think about weather when they live somewhere the weather can kill them, constantly and practically, and without indulging in resentment, because resentment didn't help, and the weather didn't care. He unloaded the wreck Sunday morning, alone, after dropping Lila at her friend Maya's house for the day. Moving the shell off the trailer and into the back bay took 3 hours and required the engine hoist modified with a wide spreader bar to support the compromised structure without stressing the weakened sections. He worked slowly and without music, which was what he did when he needed to think. Once it was down and stable on the floor stands, he walked around it 4 times without touching anything. The fire had been comprehensive. Whoever had set it, and looking at the pattern of damage, he was increasingly certain it had been set, had done a thorough job of removing the obvious identifying features. Both front and rear fascias were gone. The hood structure was gone. The interior was entirely gone, down to bare and warped metal. The engine, in the mid-rear position where it belonged, was a seized and heat-destroyed mass that retained its overall form but had long since fused internally into something closer to sculpture than machinery. But whoever had set the fire hadn't known the car the way Caleb knew it. They destroyed what was visible and obvious. They hadn't understood what was underneath. He put on latex gloves and crouched behind the rear wheel arch, reaching into the collapsed structure to find the subframe mounting point he'd seen at the auction. His fingers found the geometry before his eyes could confirm it. He knew it the way you know the feel of your own handwriting. He spent 4 hours on the floor of the garage that day, in the Sunday quiet, going through every accessible section of the remaining structure. He found 17 distinct design elements that weren't documented anywhere in any production vehicle or any publication he was aware of. Each one corresponded to something he had either designed himself or been directly involved in specifying. Each one was as familiar to him as his own reasoning, because it had come from his own reasoning. By the time he stood up, his knees were stiff and his hands were black with old soot, and his back ached from the concrete floor, and he was completely certain. The burned car in his garage bay was the prototype he had helped build, the one that was supposed to have been destroyed 20 years ago. It was not destroyed. It was here. He went to the sink and washed his hands and stood there with the water running over his knuckles, looking out the small window at the empty parking lot, and he did not feel triumph or excitement. He felt something quieter and more complicated, the way you feel when something you stopped believing in walks back through the door and sits down and looks at you, and you have to decide all over again what to do with it. Oh, he picked Lila up from Maya's house at 5 in the evening. She smelled like sunscreen and grass, and she had a bracelet she'd made from plastic beads on her wrist that she showed him with the concentrated pride of someone presenting finished work. "Maya taught me," she said. "It's good," he said, examining it with proper attention. "The color pattern is consistent." She looked at him. "That's not really a compliment about a bracelet." "It's a compliment about your eye for pattern." She considered this. "Okay," she said, deciding to accept it. They ate dinner at the kitchen table in the apartment above the garage. Pasta, which Caleb made competently, if not imaginatively, and salad from a bag that Lila assembled herself with the particular seriousness she applied to tasks she'd been given responsibility for. She asked him what he'd done while she was at Maya's, and he said he'd worked on the car. "Did you figure out what it is?" He looked at her. She had her mother's eyes in the light from the kitchen, and his own stubbornness in the set of her jaw, and she was watching him with the patience of a child who has learned that the important answers take longer to arrive. "I think so," he said. "Is it a good thing?" He thought about the prototype sitting in the bay below them, about the engineering buried inside it, the design work that had been sealed away and declared destroyed and quietly credited to someone else while his own career was dismantled by people in suits who had never once gotten their hands dirty. He thought about what it would cost to restore it and what it might be worth when it was done, and what that worth might mean for the cardiologist in Reno and the window that wasn't unlimited. He thought about what it meant to have something returned to you that you'd given up on. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I think we need to find out." Lila nodded, satisfied with this in the way she was satisfied with most of his honest answers. and reached for the salad tongs, and they finished dinner in the comfortable quiet of two people who were used to each other's company and didn't need to fill every silence. Below them, in the garage bay, the burned machine waited in the dark. It had been waiting for a long time. It could wait a little longer. The morning after the engine turned over, Caleb Hunter did not sleep. He sat in the old wooden chair beside the workbench and watched the Rosso through the half-dark of the garage, the way a person watches something they are not entirely sure is real. The overhead light had burned out sometime around 2 in the morning, and he hadn't bothered replacing it. The single work lamp on the floor threw a pale cone across the floor pan and caught the underside of the car at an angle that made it look like something being examined on an operating table, which Caleb supposed wasn't entirely wrong. It had been 11 days since he brought it home from the Nevada auction on a flatbed trailer while Lila slept across the back seat with her mouth open and her sneakers still on. 11 days of stripping burned composite panels, cataloging what remained of the chassis, running his hands over frame rails that had somehow survived temperatures that should have destroyed them. 11 days of telling himself he was being methodical and not obsessive, which was the kind of lie a man tells himself when he already knows the truth. He had not told Lila what he believed the car was. Not yet. She came out of the house at 7:15 the way she always did, still in her pajamas, her dark hair pulled into a braid that had come mostly undone overnight. She had a piece of toast in one hand and the small blue notebook she carried everywhere in the other. She stopped in the garage doorway and looked at the car and then at her father sitting in the chair. "Did you sleep out here again?" "For a little while." She walked over and stood beside him and looked at the car the way children look at things when they sense the thing matters to the adult next to them. "It looks different," she said. "I cleaned up some of the fire damage on the rocker panels." "It looks less sad." Caleb looked at her. "Cars don't get sad, Lila." She took a bite of her toast without looking away from the car. "How do you know?" He didn't have an answer for that, which was happening more and more with her lately. She was 9 and she was already asking questions that bent back on themselves in ways he wasn't expecting. Her mother used to do that, ask a question that sounded simple until you started trying to answer it and found the floor wasn't where you thought it was. "Go get ready for school," he said. "Mrs. Pruitt said you've been late twice this week." "Mrs. Pruitt counts everything." "Mrs. Pruitt is your teacher." Lila studied him for another moment, then looked back at the car. "Are you going to fix it all the way?" "I'm going to try." "Good," she said, as if that settled something. She turned and padded back toward the house, and Caleb watched her go and felt the familiar pull of it, that particular kind of worry that lives in the chest and doesn't fully leave, not ever, not since the cardiologist had sat across a desk and used words like structural anomaly and corrective intervention and long-term management in a voice calibrated to sound calm. Lila had been born with a congenital heart defect that the doctors in Sacramento had described as moderate and manageable, and a few other words that all meant the same thing, fixable, eventually, when they had the money. The surgical team at UCSF had been clear. The procedure wasn't experimental, wasn't dangerous by the standards of pediatric cardiology, but it wasn't cheap either, and their insurance covered 60% of an estimated cost that made 60% feel like a very small number. Caleb had been saving for 2.5 years. He was roughly 2/3 of the way there, which meant he was roughly 1/3 away from being able to give his daughter a normal heart. He stood up from the chair, joints complaining after a night half spent on bad upholstery, and picked up the work lamp from the floor. He had a full day of paying work ahead of him. A Subaru Outback with a head gasket problem and a Dodge pickup that had been making a noise its owner described as a sick whale. And the Rosso would have to wait until tonight. That was the arrangement he'd made with himself. Days belonged to the garage and the paying customers. Nights belonged to the car. It was a workable arrangement. He just hadn't anticipated how much he would resent the daytime for it. Teat. The man arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks and 3 days after the auction. Caleb was under the Subaru, working a stubborn coolant line fitting loose, when he heard the tires on the gravel lot outside. He heard the car door, then the silence that meant whoever it was had stopped moving. He slid out from under the vehicle and sat up and found a man standing in the open bay door with his hands in the pockets of a dark jacket and his eyes moving slowly around the garage. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, compact and careful-looking, with white hair cut short and a face that had spent time in weather. He wasn't dressed like someone with money, but he moved like someone who had once had it. There was a quiet confidence in how he stood, the kind that doesn't need a room to know it. He looked at the Rosso, parked under its canvas cover in the back corner. Then he looked at Caleb. "You bought something at the Kellerman auction," the man said. Not a question. Caleb stood and wiped his hands on a shop rag. "Lots of people bought things at the Kellerman auction." "Not what you bought." The man's accent was faint. Italian, or something shaped by Italian a long time ago. His eyes hadn't moved from the covered car. "I've been looking for that vehicle for 6 years." Caleb said nothing for a moment. He had learned over the years that silence was often the most informative thing you could offer someone. "My name is Marco Bellini," the man said. "I was the lead dynamics engineer on the project from its inception until the program was terminated. I know every weld on that chassis. I know where the tolerances were cut and where they weren't and why, and I know what the engineers who came after me got wrong." He finally looked directly at Caleb. "I'd like to see it." Caleb studied him. "How did you find me?" "Auction records are public. Your name was attached to the lot. It wasn't difficult." He paused. "I also know who you are." I didn't at first, but when I started looking, I remembered. You were on the original engineering team. You were the one who designed the cooling circuit architecture. The sentence landed the way certain sentences do, quietly, but with weight. Caleb hadn't talked about that period of his life in a long time. The end of it had left marks that didn't fade entirely, and he had built the current version of his life partly around the decision not to look back at the previous one too often. He'd been 29 when the project ended. He was 41 now, and the distance between those 2 points felt both enormous and paper-thin depending on the day. "Come inside," Caleb said. He pulled the canvas cover back slowly, and for a long moment Marco Bellini didn't say anything at all. He stood with his hands still in his pockets and looked at the car, and something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, not the way emotion works in movies, but in the small, specific way a person's face changes when they see something they have thought about for a very long time. "It's worse than I expected," he said finally. "It's better than it was." Marco crouched beside the driver's side and ran his fingers along the sill. The frame rails survived. Both of them, the roll cage too. Whoever built it to last. "That was your team," Marco said without looking up. "The safety structure was your specification." Caleb hadn't thought about that in years. The fact that something he'd designed had kept a car intact through a fire that should have destroyed it entirely. He wasn't sure what to do with that information, so he set it aside. "What happened to it?" Caleb asked. After the program ended, Marco stood slowly. "It was sold as scrap to a parts broker in Arizona, which means someone in the corporate structure wanted it to disappear without the paperwork that would come with a formal decommission. The broker sold it on. It moved through several hands before it ended up wherever it was before the fire." He looked at Caleb. "I don't know the full chain. I've been trying to reconstruct it." "Why?" "Because the program wasn't terminated for the reasons they stated." Marco said it flatly, without drama. The way you say something you've said many times in your head and are tired of carrying alone. "The official record says the prototype failed to meet performance targets. That's not what happened. What happened is that the prototype exceeded performance targets in ways that threatened a licensing agreement the parent company had with another manufacturer. Completing the car would have voided a contract worth considerably more than the development budget, so they stopped it. Caleb had suspected something like that for 12 years. Hearing it stated plainly by someone else was different than suspecting it. It made him feel two things simultaneously, vindicated and angry, and neither feeling was particularly comfortable. "I don't have the documentation to prove it," Marco continued. "The internal records were classified as proprietary and locked, but I know someone who may have copies." "Who?" "Isabella Romano. She was the project's external review coordinator, appointed by the original investment group. She had access to performance data that wasn't shared with the corporate team. I've been in contact with her. She's willing to help if this car can actually be restored." Caleb looked at the Rosso, at the scarred body and the exposed frame and the parts catalogued on his workbench. At 12 years of his professional life, burned and buried and sitting in the corner of a struggling garage in the Sierra Nevada foothills. "It can be restored, Wes," he said. "How long have you been working on it?" "Almost 3 weeks." "Alone?" "Yes." Marco was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I retired 18 months ago. I have no active contracts. I have time." He looked at Caleb steadily. "I know this car better than anyone alive, except possibly you. If you'll allow it, I'd like to help." Caleb thought about it for exactly the amount of time it took to understand that the answer had already been made before Marco finished the sentence. "There's a cot in the back room," Caleb said. "The coffee is bad, but it's strong." Marco Bellini turns out to be the kind of man who is good at working in silence. That was the first thing Caleb noticed, and it mattered more than he would have predicted. He had spent 3 weeks alone in the garage with his own thoughts and his own doubts, and he hadn't fully registered how much weight that was until there was another person present to distribute it. Marco didn't offer opinions on things that weren't asked about. He didn't fill silence with conversation for its own sake. He looked at what needed doing, and he did it. And when he had a question, he asked it directly, and when Caleb gave an answer, he accepted it without unnecessary discussion. The first project they tackled together was the electrical system, a complete loss from the fire, which everyone at the auction had assumed meant the car was an electrical loss, period. What they knew, and no one else at that auction had known, was that the prototype had carried a bespoke wiring architecture documented in engineering notes that predated the corporate handover. Caleb had his own copies, stored in a lockbox under the bench, 12-year-old printouts on paper that had gone soft at the folds. "You kept these, Rhys?" Marco said, holding the schematics under the work lamp on the second evening. "I kept everything I was legally allowed to keep, which wasn't much. This is enough." Marco studied the pages with the focused attention of a man reading a letter from someone he used to know. "The harness architecture here. We can replicate this with current materials. Better shielding than the original, actually. I've been sourcing the wire gauges. Some of the connector specifications are proprietary to a company that no longer exists. I know an alternative supplier in Milan. I can make a call." This was how the evenings proceeded. Problems that had felt singular and intractable when Caleb faced them alone turned out, when Marco examined them, to have adjacencies he hadn't considered. Not because Marco was smarter, Caleb didn't think that, and he didn't think Marco thought so either, but because Marco held a different piece of the original engineering knowledge, and the two pieces together made a more complete map than either held separately. Lila took to Marco with the unsettling directness that was particular to her. She appeared in the garage on the third evening of his stay, still in her school clothes, and stood in the doorway and looked at him with the frank assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. "You're not from here," she said. Marco looked up from the wiring diagram. "No. I'm from a place called Modena, in Italy." "Do they make cars there?" "They make some of the best cars in the world there." Lila considered this. "My dad says the best cars are the ones that run when they're supposed to." Marco looked at Caleb. Caleb shrugged. "Your father is a practical man," Marco said. "He's not wrong. But some cars are more than practical." "Like this one?" "Like this one." She walked over and stood beside Marco and looked at the schematic spread across the bench. She pointed to a cluster of lines near the center of the diagram. "What's that?" "That's the power distribution node. Everything flows through there." "Like a heart," she said. Neither man said anything for a moment. "Yes," Marco said carefully. "Like a heart." Lila nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already thought. Then she looked at Caleb. "I have homework." "I know. Are you coming inside?" "In an hour." She looked at the schematic one more time, then walked back to the house without ceremony. Marco watched her go. "She's something," he said. "She is," Caleb agreed. Marco was quiet for a moment, then turned back to the diagram. "What's her prognosis, if you don't mind?" Caleb minded, in the general sense that he minded anything that made him say the words out loud. But there was something in Marco's directness that made deflection feel like more effort than honesty. "Good. If we get the surgery funded, the procedure corrects the defect. She'd have a normal life afterward." He paused. "We're about 40,000 short of what we need." Marco said nothing. He looked at the schematic. Then he looked at the car. "Then we had better build it right," he said. "Volta." The rumor started about 5 weeks after Marco arrived, which was faster than Caleb had expected, but not faster than Marco had warned. "These things travel," Marco had said early on. "Someone at the auction will have logged what you paid for that lot. Someone who knows automotive provenance will eventually match the descriptions. By the time we're halfway through the restoration, people will be calling." He was right. The first call came from a number with a Beverly Hills area code, a man who identified himself as a collector's representative and offered, without having seen the car, $150,000 for it in its current condition. Caleb declined. The second call came 3 days later, $210,000. Also declined. The third call was different. A man named Aldrich Tanner, who did not use a representative and who made clear within the first 60 seconds of the conversation that he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. He'd bought and sold enough significant vehicles that his name existed in a particular corner of the collector world the way certain names do, unavoidably and with a faint atmosphere of warning around it. "You're rebuilding a burned prototype with a dead program behind it," Tanner said. "Whatever you think it's worth unfinished, I'll double that." "It's not for sale unfinished," Caleb said. "Everything is for sale." "Not this." There was a pause on the line. Caleb could hear the particular quality of silence that comes from someone recalibrating. "You're a mechanic in the foothills with a sick kid," Tanner said. "I've done my research. I know what you need. Name the number." It was the sick kid that did it. Not in the way Tanner intended. Not as leverage. Not as a soft point to press. It made Caleb feel, very clearly, what he was and wasn't willing to do. "Don't call again," Caleb said, and ended the call. He stood in the garage for a moment after, listening to the particular silence of a building where someone has been working hard and stopped. Then he picked up a wrench and went back to work. Marco appeared from under the car. "Tanner? How did you know?" "He called me 2 days ago. I didn't mention it because I assumed you'd handle it the same way I did." "Which was?" "I told him the car belonged to someone else and hung up." Marco slid back under the chassis. "He'll try again? He always does." Caleb set the wrench down and looked at the car. "Then we work faster," he said. That became the shape of the weeks that followed. Days in the garage with paying customers, evenings and nights with the Rosso, Lila moving between the house and the shop with her notebook and her questions, Marco sleeping on the cot in the back room and eating whatever Caleb cooked with polite gratitude and no complaints. The work moved in the way serious restoration work always moves. Not in dramatic leaps, but in the slow accumulation of problems solved and pieces reclaimed, each day's progress barely visible in isolation, but unmistakable when measured against where they'd started. The body panels were the most visible difficulty, and the one that attracted the most attention from the occasional customer who wandered toward the back of the shop. The original composite bodywork was beyond salvage. The fire had seen to that. But the mounting points and the underlying geometry were intact, and Marco had, through careful contact with an Italian coach builder he'd worked with 30 years ago, identified a fabricator in Reno who could produce panels to the original specifications given sufficient documentation. Sufficient documentation was a problem they hadn't yet fully solved. Caleb knew what the blueprints had shown. Marco knew what the engineering intent had been. But the original fabrication documents, the ones that carried the precise surface geometry and panel thickness tolerances, had been held by the corporate entity that shut the program down, and had not been seen by either of them in over a decade. This was where Isabella Romano entered the conversation, and where things became, as Marco put it on a cold October evening with the wind coming off the hills and both of them standing beside the half-rebuilt car, considerably more interesting. "She has them," Marco said. "She told me last week. She retained copies of the complete fabrication package as part of the project documentation she held in her role as external review coordinator. The company never asked for them back, possibly because by the time the program ended, no one in the corporate structure knew she had them." Caleb looked at him. "Where is she?" "Portland. She said she'd come." Marco paused. "She wants to see the car first, before she hands over anything." "That's fair." "She also wants to understand what you intend to do with it." Caleb looked at the Rosso, at the bare frame and the partially restored interior and the engine that sat in the cradle, cleaned and inspected and waiting. At the car that had been his work 12 years ago and had come back to him in the form of a burned wreck that no one else wanted. I intend to finish it, he said. And after? One thing at a time. Marco looked at him for a moment, then nodded. I'll call her in the morning. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the property, and inside the garage, the overhead light cast its steady, pale circle over the car. And Caleb Hunter stood with his hands in his pockets and thought about what it means to pick something up that was left for dead and carry it far enough to find out whether it still has life in it. He thought he probably knew the answer. He'd known it since the night at the auction when every other person in that hangar had looked at the burned wreck and seen a loss. And something in him, some stubborn instrument he'd never found a name for, had looked at the same thing and seen something unfinished. There was a difference between broken and unfinished. His daughter had told him so without knowing she was telling him. He reached over and turned off the work lamp and stood for a moment in the dark with the car. Then he went inside to make sure Lila had eaten dinner. Isabella Romano drove up from the airport in a rental car that she parked slightly crooked in the gravel lot, which was the first thing Caleb noticed about her. The second was that she was younger than he'd expected. Mid-50s maybe, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of posture that comes from spending decades in rooms where people are always trying to establish hierarchy. She carried a hard-shell briefcase that looked like it had been through a great deal, and a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she walked toward the garage with the purposeful stride of someone who has decided in advance not to be intimidated by whatever she finds there. She stopped at the bay door and looked at the Rosso. Not at Caleb, not at Marco, who was standing to the left with his arms crossed. At the car. She stood there for what felt like a full minute without speaking, and Caleb let her because he understood that kind of silence. He'd stood in it himself the morning after the auction when Lila was asleep and the garage was quiet, and he'd pulled back the canvas for the first time alone and just looked. It's further along than I expected, Isabella said finally. Further along than it was 3 months ago, Marco said. She set down the canvas bag and walked around the car slowly, the way a person walks around something they are trying to understand from every angle. She crouched beside the driver's door and looked at the door hinge points. She stood and ran one hand along the roofline. She stopped at the rear and studied the exposed engine cradle and the engine sitting in it, cleaned and reassembled to the point they'd reached. Then she looked at Caleb. "You're the cooling architecture," she said. "That's what Marco tells me you call me." Something in her face relaxed slightly. Not a smile exactly, but a softening. "I call you that because it's the most remarkable piece of engineering in the whole project. I said so in my review. The committee buried the review, but I said it." She looked back at the car. "You were 29. 28 when I designed it. 29 when they shut it down." "They shut a lot of things down." She said it without particular bitterness, which Caleb found more unsettling than anger would have been. Anger suggests you still believe the thing should have gone differently. What Isabella Romano sounded like was someone who had long since accepted the shape of what happened and was here now because acceptance and action were not the same thing. She opened the briefcase on the workbench. The documents were organized in flat archival sleeves, the kind used for engineering drawings. Large format paper, some of it yellowed at the edges, some of it printed on materials that had held up better than expected. She laid them out methodically, and Caleb and Marco stood on either side of her and looked at pages they hadn't seen in 12 years. The fabrication package was complete. Surface geometry, panel thickness specifications, mounting tolerances, composite layup schedules for every body panel. Caleb picked up the page covering the front hood assembly and held it under the work lamp and felt something that he couldn't name precisely. Recognition was part of it, and grief was part of it, and something else underneath both of those that was quieter and more durable. "These are the originals?" he asked. "Certified copies. The originals are in a secure location. I made these the week the program was terminated, before the corporate team came through to collect materials." She paused. "I had a feeling they'd be needed eventually. Did you know what they were doing when they shut it down?" She was quiet for a moment. "I suspected. I didn't have proof." She reached into the briefcase and produced a separate folder, thinner than the fabrication package, and set it on the bench. "Now I do." Caleb looked at the folder but didn't open it. "Internal communications," Isabella said, "between the VP of Product Strategy and the legal team handling the licensing agreement. They came to me through a source I won't name, 3 years ago." I've had them verified. She looked at Caleb steadily. The licensing agreement is referenced explicitly. The concern about performance data exceeding the parameters that would trigger a competitive clause in the contract is stated in plain language. So is the decision to classify the prototype's results as a failure. Marco said something in Italian under his breath that Caleb didn't catch. This is enough? Caleb asked. For what purpose? To correct the record. The official engineering record lists the prototype as a failed experiment. My name is on that record. So is Marco's. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. It's enough for that. The fabrication documents changed the pace of everything. The coach builder in Reno, a compact, precise man named Gary Osei, who had spent 30 years building one-off bodies for collectors and racing teams, had been waiting on exactly this kind of documentation before he could commit his shop to the panel work. When Caleb drove down with the archival copies and spread them on Gary's layout table, the man studied them for 40 minutes without speaking, occasionally measuring something with a scaled rule and making small notations on a pad, and then looked up. This is proper documentation, Gary said, with the reverence of a craftsman who has spent too much of his career working from approximations. It's the original fabrication spec. Gary looked at the drawings again. The front quarter geometry is going to be interesting. That compound curve on the leading edge. Whoever designed this was showing off a little. The original designer was Italian, Caleb said. That explains it. He picked up the hood assembly drawing. 6 weeks. I can have the full panel set in 6 weeks if I start Monday. What do you need from us? A deposit and the door to stay out of my way. Caleb wrote the deposit check standing at Gary's counter and felt it in the way he always felt large checks. As a physical event, a weight leaving one side of a scale and landing on the other. The garage account could cover it, barely. It left them thin on operating margin for the next month, which meant he needed the Subaru and the Dodge pickup and the 3 other vehicles currently in the queue to go smoothly and without expensive complications, which in the automotive repair business was an optimistic thing to want. He drove back up the mountain with the heater running and the radio off, and his thoughts moving through the project the way he mapped a difficult repair, backward from the finished state, identifying each step that had to precede each other's step until you arrived at where you currently were and understood the distance between the 2 points. He was, he thought, about 60% of the way there. It was a long 60% pekin. The second call from Aldrich Tanner came on a Tuesday evening in early November. Caleb was in the garage and Lila was at the workbench doing homework. She had taken to doing her homework at the bench in the evenings, which Caleb suspected was less about the quality of the workspace and more about not wanting to be in the house alone. Marco was in the back room on a call to his Italian supplier about the connector specifications they still needed. The phone rang, and Caleb looked at the number and answered it because he had decided before it rang that if Tanner called again, he would answer and say clearly what needed to be said. "I told you not to call," Caleb said, "and yet here we are." Tanner's voice had the smooth, layered quality of someone who learned a long time ago that warmth and threat could coexist in the same register. "I've been doing more research. I know about the Romano documentation. I know what you have now." Caleb said nothing. Lila had looked up from her homework. "Here's what I know," Tanner continued. "I know that car, fully documented and with provenance restored, is worth somewhere between 1.2 and 1.8 million at the right auction. I know you're a single father with a kid who needs a surgery that costs roughly $240,000. I know you're running a garage in the foothills that barely clears $30,000 a year." A pause. "I'm offering you $600,000 right now, today. Wire transfer. You walk away with enough to cover the surgery, pay off your building, and have a cushion left over." Lila was still looking at him. He turned slightly away from her. "You've done a lot of research," Caleb said. "I do my homework." "Then you should know that the answer is still no." Why? Not angry, genuinely curious, in the way that certain kinds of men are genuinely curious when they encounter a decision they can't fit inside their model of how people work. Caleb thought about how to answer that. He thought about the fabrication drawings spread on his workbench. He thought about Marco asleep on the cot in the back room with a career that had been falsified on paper. He thought about Isabella Romano keeping a folder of internal communications for 3 years because she had a feeling they'd be needed. He thought about a burned wreck in a Nevada salvage lot that a room full of professionals had looked at and seen nothing worth having. Because it's not finished, Caleb said, and I don't sell things before they're finished. He ended the call. Lila was watching him. Who is that? Someone who wants to buy the car. Are you going to sell it? Not yet. She thought about this. When will it be finished? When it's finished. She looked at him with the particular expression she had that meant she was deciding whether to push on something. She decided not to. She went back to her homework. From the back room, Marco appeared in the doorway. He had heard enough. He looked at Caleb for a moment. Good, Marco said simply, and went back to his call. The body panels arrived on a Thursday morning in the first week of December, wrapped in moving blankets in the back of Gary Osai's truck. Gary and his assistant carried them into the garage one at a time with the careful deliberation of people transporting things that do not have duplicates, which was accurate. Caleb had cleared the floor and prepped the mounting surfaces over the previous week, and the three of them, Caleb, Marco, Gary, spent the entire day fitting panels. It was the kind of work that demands more patience than skill, because the skill you've built over years is exactly what lets you feel the half-millimeter misalignment that will compound into a visible gap by the time the door closes, and the temptation is always to force the thing, rather than back up and find the source. Marco was the one who caught the issue with the left rear quarter panel at around 4 in the afternoon. Stop, he said, quietly, but with enough weight in it that both Caleb and Gary stopped. Marco crouched and looked at the fit line between the rear quarter and the trunk lid aperture. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and ran it along the seam. The mounting tab here is 3 millimeters low, he said. Gary came around and looked. His face did the thing faces do when the person doesn't want to admit something. The spec calls for... I know what the spec calls for. I wrote the spec. Marco looked up at Gary without any particular heat in it. The mounting surface on the chassis shifted during the fire, very slightly. The original documentation was accurate for the original chassis geometry. He stood. We need to shim it. Gary looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the seam. He's right, Caleb said. Gary straightened up. He was not a man who took correction badly, which was one of the reasons Caleb had come to him in the first place. Give me an hour, he said. They took a break. Caleb made coffee in the back room and brought it out, and they stood around the car in the early December cold that came through the open bay door, and Marco held his mug in both hands and looked at the Rosso the way he'd looked at it that first evening, with that particular expression that was neither sentiment nor detachment, but something in between. We're close, Marco said. Getting there. The engine is the last major piece. Engine is ready. It's been ready. Caleb looked at the car. Once the panels are finished and the electrical is fully connected, it's a startup sequence. Marco nodded slowly. Have you thought about who should be present for that? Caleb hadn't, specifically. He'd thought about it in the abstract. Thought about the moment the way you think about something you want badly enough that you can't quite picture it directly. Isabella should be here, he said. Yes. And Lila. Marco looked at him. She's 9. She's been part of this since the first night. She's going to be here when it starts. Marco considered this, then nodded. There was something in his face that Caleb couldn't fully read. Approval, maybe, or something older than approval. Gary came back with a shimming solution that was precise and correct and cost another 3 hours of careful fitting, but when the rear quarter finally sat where it was supposed to sit, the fit line was what it was supposed to be, and nobody in that garage had a complaint about the time. The evening they completed the electrical connection, a Saturday, mid-December, with frost on the gravel outside and steam from their breath in the cold garage air, Caleb sat on the floor beside the driver's side and ran the diagnostic sequence one more time. The car accepted the sequence. Every system reported what it was supposed to report. The onboard diagnostics, reconstructed from the original software architecture by a programmer Marco knew in Turin, who had been sent the specifications and asked to reverse engineer a working version, a process that had taken 6 weeks and 2 rounds of revision, came up clean. Caleb sat there on the concrete floor for a while, not doing anything, which was not his usual mode of operation, but which felt, at that moment, like the right response. Marco crouched beside him and looked at the diagnostic readout on the temporary display they'd rigged to the OBD port. "That's all of it," Marco said. "That's all of it." They sat with that for a moment. "I want to call Isabella," Caleb said. "I want everyone here when we start it." "She can be here by Thursday." "Thursday, then." Marco nodded and stood, joints cracking. He was 64 and he had spent the better part of 3 months on concrete floors and under chassis rails, and it was written in the way he moved. He didn't complain about it. Caleb appreciated that more than he could say. "Caleb," Marco said. Caleb looked up. "When this car starts..." Marco stopped. He looked at the car for a moment. "I've been carrying what happened to this project for 12 years. I want you to know that." He paused again, the way people pause when they are being careful with something that matters. Whatever happens after Thursday, whatever it amounts to, it already means something. That the car exists, that it's finished, that what we actually did is somewhere in the world, intact. Caleb looked at the Rosso, at the body panels that Gary had shaped from archived specifications, at the electrical system rebuilt from 12-year-old schematics, at the engine in its cradle, reassembled to tolerances that matched the original intent, at the car that had existed and been denied and burned and buried and bought from a pile of scrap for $340. "I know," Caleb said. He meant it. Lila had a cardiology appointment on Wednesday. A routine check, the kind they did every 4 months to monitor the defect's behavior and confirm nothing was progressing faster than expected. Caleb drove her to Sacramento, which was 2 hours each way, and they listened to a podcast about deep-sea fish for most of the first hour, because Lila was in a phase with deep-sea fish and had been for the better part of 6 weeks. The cardiologist was a calm, thorough woman named Dr. Vasquez, who had been Lila's doctor since she was 3. She did the echo and the EKG and the physical exam, and came back into the room with the results the way she always did, efficiently, without preamble, because she understood that the waiting was the worst part, and she had the courtesy not to extend it unnecessarily. "Still stable," she said. "The parameters are consistent with what we saw in August." She looked at Caleb. "How are we doing on the funding side?" "Getting closer," Caleb said. Dr. Vasquez nodded. She had learned over 6 years of treating Lila not to push on that question, which Caleb respected. "The window for the optimal intervention is still open. We're not in a critical situation, but I want to schedule the surgery within the year." "Understood." Lila sat on the exam table, eating a cracker from the basket on the counter, and looked between them with the calm assessment of a child who has been a patient long enough to understand the language of medical conversations without understanding all the words. "My dad is almost done with the car," she said to Dr. Vasquez. Dr. Vasquez looked at Caleb. "The project you mentioned?" "Yes." "When it sells," Lila said, with the certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than a speculation, "we'll have the money." "Doctor." Vasquez smiled at her. "Then I hope it sells quickly." "It will," Lila said. She looked at Caleb. "Won't it?" It was not quite a question and not quite a statement, and Caleb looked at his daughter sitting on the exam table with her feet dangling and her cracker in her hand and her absolute, uncomplicated confidence in him. And he felt the full weight of it. The way you feel things that you've been carrying so long, you've forgotten what it's like to set them down. "Yes," he said. Isabella Romano arrived Thursday morning at 11. Same rental car, same slightly crooked parking. She walked into the garage and stopped in the doorway and looked at the Rosso the way she'd looked at it the first time, but different. The first time there had been evaluation in it. This time there was something else that Caleb didn't immediately identify, and then did. Recognition. The car looked like what it had always been supposed to look like. The body panels sat where the drawings had specified. The proportions were correct. The lines resolved the way the original designers, the people in this room, had intended them to resolve. She put her hand over her mouth for a moment, then she lowered it. "All right," she said. "Let's start it." Lila was already at the back of the garage, standing at a careful distance the way Caleb had asked her to stand, in her winter coat with her notebook in her hands. She had not opened the notebook. She was watching. Marco primed the fuel system. Caleb ran the pre-start diagnostic one final time and watched the readout and felt his own heartbeat in his ears in a way he would not have admitted to anyone in that room. He reached in through the window and opened the engine ignition sequence. The starter motor engaged. There was a mechanical sound, gears meshing, the engine turning over, and then a hesitation that lasted long enough that Caleb thought, with cold clarity, that something was wrong, and he would need to stop and find it. Then the engine caught. It didn't roar. That was the first thing. It came up from silence into a sound that was low and layered and deeply, specifically itself. A sound that had existed for exactly 2 seconds, 12 years ago before the program was terminated and had not existed since. A sound that had lived in the engineering documents and the memory of the people in this room and nowhere else in the world. The garage filled with it. Caleb stood beside the car and listened, and felt something he had no precise vocabulary for. Not pride, not vindication, not simple relief, though it was all of those. Something underneath all of those, that had to do with the 12 years between the last time this engine ran and this moment, and what those years had contained, and the fact that some things can be left unfinished without being lost. He looked at Marco. Marco was not looking at the car. He was looking at the floor, and his jaw was set tight, and his eyes were doing something that he was clearly working to manage. He looked up and met Caleb's eyes and gave a single, short nod. Caleb looked at Lila. She was standing at her careful distance with her notebook pressed to her chest and her eyes very wide and very bright. She was not writing anything in it. She was just watching, just present, the way children are present when something happens that they understand is important without understanding all the reasons why. She caught his eye and said nothing. She smiled at him. Not the big smile she used when something was simply fun, but the small private one she saved for the moments that mattered. Caleb turned back to the car and stood with his hand on the roof and listened to the engine run, steady and even and exactly as it had been designed to run. Isabella Romano was standing with her arms crossed and her eyes on the car, and her chin lifted and her face wearing an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever, which was the most honest thing Caleb had seen in a long time. Outside, the December air moved through the pines, and inside the garage the engine turned over in the cold, and the sound of it filled every corner of the building. And for a while nobody said anything at all because there was nothing that needed to be said. The news moved the way news moves in a small, specific world. Not through press releases or public announcements, but through a phone call to someone who told 2 people who each told 3 more. And by the time January arrived, the automotive collector community had formed a collective understanding that something significant had surfaced in the Sierra Nevada foothills, been restored by people who knew what it actually was, and was no longer a rumor. Caleb received 41 inquiries in the first 3 weeks of January. He knew this because Isabella kept count, which she had appointed herself to do without being asked, in the same way she had appointed herself to handle the documentation filing and the preliminary correspondence with the legal team she had retained in San Francisco to manage the provenance restoration process. She had not moved back to Portland. She was sleeping in the spare room of a motel 6 miles down the mountain and driving up every morning, and when Caleb had asked her, carefully, why she was still here, she had looked at him with the expression of someone who considers the question slightly beneath them. "Because it's not finished," she said, which was the same thing he had said to Tanner, and he did not point that out, but he noticed it. The legal process for correcting the engineering record was slower than any of them had wanted, and faster than the attorney had warned them to expect. The documentation Isabella had retained, combined with the internal communications that had come through her source, constituted what the attorney, a small, meticulous woman named Patricia Sohn, who communicated exclusively by email and billed in 6-minute increments, described as a strong evidentiary package. The corporate entity that had shut down the program had since been acquired twice and existed now under a different name with different leadership, which meant the liability picture was complicated enough that the current owners had reason to cooperate rather than contest. The preliminary agreement to correct the official engineering record, to reclassify the prototype's results as successful, and to restore Caleb Hunter and Marco Bellini as principal engineers of record, came through on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of January. Patricia Sohn sent a single email with the subject line, "Agreement received, review attached." Caleb read it standing at the workbench with the garage empty and Marco in town running an errand, and the feeling it produced was not what he had expected. He had expected relief or satisfaction or some version of vindication. What he felt instead was something quieter, a settling, the way a structure settles when a load it has been bearing unevenly is redistributed. He called Marco. "It went through," he said when Marco picked up. A silence on the line, then, "The full correction?" "Principal engineers of record, both of us." Another silence, longer. "I need a moment," Marco said. "Take your time." He heard Marco set the phone down. He stood in the garage and looked at the Rosso, completed now, sitting in the bay under the overhead lights with all of its panels in place and its geometry resolved and its engine capable of running, and waited. Marco came back on the line. "All right," he said. His voice was level, but only barely. "All right. Come back when you're ready," Caleb said. "We have work to do." But the invitation from the Halloran exhibition came through Isabella's contacts, not Caleb's, which was appropriate since Caleb had no contacts in the international automotive exhibition world and no particular desire to develop them. The Halloran was held in late March at a private facility outside Monterey, not the public concourse, but a separate invitation-only event attended by collectors, curators, and a particular category of automotive journalists who wrote for publications with small circulations and significant influence. It was, Isabella explained, exactly the right venue. "Not the biggest," she said, spreading the event documentation across the kitchen table one evening in early February, while Lila did homework at the other end. "But the most serious. The people who attend the Halloran make decisions. They don't just look." "What kind of decisions?" Caleb asked. "Acquisition decisions. Institutional decisions." She looked at him. "Museum acquisition decisions." Caleb poured himself coffee and stood leaning against the counter. He was still not entirely comfortable with the pace at which the world around the car was organizing itself. He understood the mechanical work. He understood the restoration logic. The exhibition and sale architecture that Isabella was building felt like a different language, one he was learning on the fly with a teacher who assumed comprehension faster than it was actually occurring. "Walk me through the museum option," he said. Isabella folded her hands on the table. Lila, without looking up from her homework, turned a page in her notebook. "There are 3 institutions that would be appropriate, 2 in Europe, 1 in California. The California option is the most viable. They have an active acquisition budget, they specialize in engineering history, and their curator has already expressed informal interest through a third party." She paused. "Museum acquisition means the car is preserved, permanently accessible to the public, and attributed correctly. Your name is on the wall. Marco's name is on the wall. The provenance is on the wall. And the sale price? At auction, with the provenance fully restored and the documentation package we have, a car like this could reach 1.5, possibly higher. Private institutional sale is different, less competitive, more negotiated, probably in the range of 900,000 to 1.1 million. Caleb did the arithmetic he had been doing in various forms for 3 months. Lila's surgery, fully funded. The garage debt retired. Marco compensated for what the project had cost him in time and travel. Isabella's legal fees covered. A cushion that would let him run the garage without the constant low-level pressure of a business operating without margin. And the car in a museum where it would be seen and understood and attributed to the people who actually built it. "The auction option," he said. "Tell me why we don't do that." "We could," Isabella said. "The upside is higher. The risk is also higher. Auction outcomes are variable, and the buyer pool at that price point includes people like Tanner, who will pay whatever is necessary to acquire the car privately and then do whatever he wants with it, disappear it into a collection, strip it for parts, sell it again in 5 years with the provenance obscured." She met his eyes. "I've seen it happen with less significant vehicles." Lila looked up. "What's a provenance?" "The history of where something came from and who made it," Caleb said. She thought about this. "Like a birth certificate." "Something like that." She went back to her homework. Caleb looked at Isabella. "Set up the meeting with the California Museum," he said. The museum curator was a tall man named Vincent Chu, who arrived at the garage in mid-February, wearing a jacket that probably cost more than Caleb's monthly revenue, and carrying nothing at all, no briefcase, no portfolio, no props of institutional authority. He walked in and shook hands with each of them, and then stood in front of the Rosso for a long time with his hands in his pockets. And Caleb recognized the quality of his attention because it was the same quality of attention Marco had brought on his first day, and Isabella on hers. The attention of someone who already knows what they are looking at and is verifying that the reality matches the knowledge. The cooling architecture, Vincent said, studying the engine bay. I've read about this system in the original engineering literature. I've never seen it in physical form. You weren't supposed to, Caleb said. It was supposed to have been destroyed. Vincent looked at him. How did it survive the fire? The firewall specification I used was over-engineered for the purpose. It was a choice I made at the time that the cost reduction team wasn't happy about. Caleb paused. I didn't anticipate a fire. I just didn't like the margins. Vincent looked at the engine bay again for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. 12 years ago, where was your career supposed to go from this project? It was a direct question, the kind Caleb didn't always answer from strangers, but something about the directness itself made deflection feel unnecessary. I was going to lead my own program. This was the demonstration project. After this, I was supposed to have the resources and the authority to build the team I wanted and develop the next generation from scratch. He said it without self-pity, which had been a long time coming. Instead, I spent 3 years consulting on work that wasn't interesting and then started the garage. Do you regret the garage? Caleb thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. No, but I regret what it cost to get there. Vincent nodded slowly. The museum's position, he said, is that the engineering history of this car is as significant as the car itself. We would want to present both: the fabrication documentation, the internal communications, the corrected engineering record. All of it is context for what the object represents. He looked at the Rosso. Not just a beautiful car, a document of how something important gets buried and how it comes back. Caleb said nothing for a moment. He looked at the car and then at Vincent. What are you offering? He asked. Vincent named a number. It was in the range Isabella had indicated, at the upper end. He named it without preamble or negotiation theater, in the same tone someone uses when they have thought carefully about a number and are stating it rather than proposing it. Caleb looked at Isabella. She gave him a small, neutral nod that meant, this is real. He looked at Marco, who was standing with his arms crossed at the side of the car. Marco raised his eyebrows slightly, also meaning, this is real. I need a week, Caleb said. Take 2, Vincent said, without any pressure in it. He did not take 2 weeks. He took 5 days, during which he did the following things. He drove to Sacramento and sat with Dr. Vasquez and confirmed the surgical timeline and the exact number required to schedule the procedure. He called Patricia Sohn and reviewed the sale agreement terms. He drove up to the ridge road above the garage on a cold February evening and sat in his truck and looked at the lights of the valley below and thought about the version of himself that had stood in a conference room 12 years ago and been told that the work he had done was inadequate and the project was over. He thought about what that version of himself would have made of this moment. He decided that version of himself would not have been able to imagine it clearly enough to want it, which seemed right. The things that are actually worth having rarely look like what you expected when you pictured them wanting them. He called Isabella on the 5th day. Yes, he said, I'll contact Vincent. One condition, the attribution on the exhibition display. I want Marco's name first. A pause. He was lead dynamics engineer. You were cooling systems. I know what we were. I want his name first. Another pause, shorter. I'll make the call, Isabella said. The Halloran exhibition was held on a Saturday in late March, in a facility that had been a private airfield before it was converted into an event space. Large, high-ceilinged, with natural light coming through clerestory windows and a concrete floor that had been polished to the point where the cars reflected in it like water. There were 14 vehicles in the exhibition. The Rosso was given a corner position with additional floor space, which Vincent had arranged, and the documentation display stood on a freestanding panel beside it. Fabrication drawings, engineering specifications, the corrected official record, a brief timeline of the car's history written by Isabella that Caleb had read twice and approved with minor edits, and one deletion. He had not wanted to attend. He had made this clear to Isabella on 3 separate occasions, and she had listened to him each time with the expression of someone waiting for a person to finish saying something they don't mean. "You built it," she said the 3rd time. "You stand next to it. I fixed it. Other people built it originally. You and Marco built it originally. You restored it. The distinction between building and restoring is meaningful to engineers and irrelevant to everyone else." She looked at him. "You stand next to it." He stood next to it. Marco stood on the other side. Isabella stood near the documentation panel and spoke with the people who came to read it, which was most of them, because Isabella Romano turned out to be the kind of person who could explain complex engineering history to a mixed audience without condescending to anyone, which was rarer than it should have been. Lila was there in a dark green dress that she had picked herself, and shoes that were slightly too formal for her age and completely correct for the occasion, and she moved through the event with the self-possession of a child who is comfortable in rooms full of adults because she has spent most of her life in them. She stood beside the car for a long time, reading the documentation display, which she had not seen in its final form before today, and Caleb watched her read it from across the room and felt something he could not name and did not try to. The reactions from the collectors and engineers who came through were various. Some of them were the reactions of people encountering something they recognize as significant and are processing in real time. Some were more complicated. There were several people present who had been in the industry during the period the program was terminated, and their reactions to the internal communications on the documentation panel had the particular quality of people being confirmed in a suspicion they had never been able to prove. One man, older, a former development engineer at a European manufacturer whose name Caleb recognized, stood in front of the car for nearly 20 minutes without speaking to anyone, and when he finally turned to Caleb and spoke, what he said was, "I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry it happened to this car." "It's here now," Caleb said. "Yes," the man said. "It is." The offer from Aldrich Tanner arrived through an intermediary at approximately 2 in the afternoon, delivered by a young man in a good suit who found Caleb near the documentation panel and said, quietly, that his employer was prepared to offer $1.4 million for the vehicle as it stood, with immediate transfer. Caleb looked at the young man for a moment. "Tell him no," Caleb said. The young man hesitated. "He asked me to convey that the offer is—" "I heard you. Tell him no." The young man left. Marco appeared at Caleb's shoulder. "Tanner?" "Through a representative this time." "Higher than before?" "Significantly." Marco was quiet. Then, "Still no?" "Still no." Marco nodded and went back to his position beside the car. The private road Vincent Chu had arranged for the performance demonstration ran along the California coast between 2 headlands, roughly 4 miles of maintained asphalt that belonged to a private land trust and was used twice a year for exactly this kind of purpose. The date was a Sunday in early April, the week after the exhibition, with the marine layer still low in the morning and the light coming through it flat and silver. There were 11 people present, Vincent and 2 colleagues from the museum, Isabella, Marco, Gary Osei, Patricia Sohn, 2 members of the collector community whose opinions Vincent considered worth having, a journalist from an automotive publication whose name Caleb didn't recognize but Marco apparently did, and Lila, who stood with Marco near the timing markers and watched with her notebook open for the first time in 3 days. Caleb drove the car himself. He had driven it 3 times in the 2 weeks since the exhibition. Short runs on the road above the garage, enough to verify the systems and feel the behavior and identify 2 minor calibrations that needed adjustment in the suspension geometry. This was different. This was the road the car had been designed for, or something close to it, with enough clear distance to actually ask the question the engineers had originally intended to ask. He sat in the seat and put his hands on the wheel and thought about the cooling circuit he had designed when he was 28 years old, and the fact that it was running correctly beneath him, and the fact that 12 years had passed between the last time it ran and this morning. Then he stopped thinking about any of that and drove. The car answered exactly as the original specifications had promised it would answer. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical violence that certain performance vehicles use to announce themselves, but with a precision and a consistency that was its own kind of statement. The balance through the coastal curves was what Marco had argued for in the original dynamics review and what the corporate team had questioned, and Marco had been correct. And the car said so on this road on this Sunday morning in the flat silver April light without needing anyone to explain it. He brought it back along the return run and slowed through the final section and pulled up to the group and stopped. He sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Through the windshield, he could see Marco standing with his arms at his sides and his face doing the thing it had done in the garage the night the engine first ran. That tight, controlled expression of a man managing something large. He could see Isabella with her arms crossed and her chin up and her eyes on the car. He could see Lila standing beside Marco with her notebook in both hands, watching him through the glass. She raised one hand and gave him a small wave, the kind she gave him in the school pickup line when she spotted his truck. Completely ordinary. Completely her. He got out of the car. Vincent Chu met him at the door. They shook hands, and Vincent said nothing for a moment, which was appropriate. "I want to say something for the record," Vincent said finally. "In my professional assessment, this vehicle performs at the level its engineering documentation claims it performs at. The specifications were accurate. The program's official termination report was not." "I know," Caleb said. "I wanted to say it in front of witnesses." Caleb looked at him. Then he looked at Marco, who had heard, and whose expression had shifted to something that had less management in it and more relief. "Thank you," Caleb said. He meant it for Marco as much as for Vincent. The journalist was taking notes. Patricia Sohn was on her phone, probably billing. Gary Ossie was crouched beside the front wheel arch looking at the tire wear pattern with professional absorption. Isabella was watching Caleb with the expression she had worn since she arrived in his garage. Watchful, assessing, satisfied in a way that wasn't quite comfortable, like a person who has carried a weight long enough that the absence of it takes some adjustment. Lila came over and stood beside him and looked at the car. "Was it fast?" she asked. "Fast enough." "How fast is fast enough?" He thought about it. "Fast enough to prove the point." She considered this. "What's the point?" He looked at the car on the road with the ocean behind it and the silver light coming off the water. "That it works," he said. "That it always worked." Lila looked at the car for a moment. Then she looked up at him with the calm, steady attention she brought to things that mattered to her. "I knew it would," she said, and said it with such complete absence of doubt that Caleb had nothing to say in response, so he put his hand on her shoulder and they stood there together looking at the car on the road, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The sale closed on a Thursday morning in the second week of April, 11 days after the coastal road demonstration, in Patricia Sohn's San Francisco office, on the 14th floor of a building that looked out over the bay. The paperwork was substantial. Patricia had warned them it would be, and she had been accurate. And Caleb signed his name in 11 places while Vincent Chu signed in 9, and Isabella witnessed, and Marco sat in a chair against the wall with his jacket on his knees and his eyes moving through the window at the water below. When it was done, Patricia gathered the pages into a folder with the brisk efficiency of a person for whom the completion of a complex process is satisfying rather than emotional. She looked at Caleb. "Wire transfer will clear by end of business today. I'll send confirmation when it posts." Caleb nodded. He looked at the pen in his hand for a moment. An ordinary ballpoint, the kind that sits in a cup on every attorney's desk, and set it down. Vincent shook his hand. "The museum will take possession next week. We'll handle transport. You don't need to do anything further on that end." "Where will it be displayed?" "Main hall. Engineering history wing. There will be a permanent installation. The car, the documentation, the timeline." Vincent paused. "Your name and Marco's on the primary attribution panel." Caleb looked across the room at Marco, who had heard and whose face was doing the thing it did when he was managing something that mattered. Marco met his eyes and gave a small nod, the same nod he had given in the garage the night the engine first ran. They did not say anything else about it. Some things don't require speech to be understood, and both of them were old enough to know which things those were. The confirmation email from the bank arrived at 4:47 in the afternoon, while Caleb was driving back up the mountain with the radio off and the window cracked and the late April air coming in smelling of pine and warm dirt. He pulled over at the wide shoulder near the top of the grade where you could see the valley laid out below, and he sat in the truck and read the email twice. He had thought, in the abstract, that this moment would feel large, climactic in the way certain moments in stories are climactic, a clear before and after, something that announces itself. What it actually felt like was quieter than that. It felt like setting something down that you have carried so long you've forgotten how much it weighs until the moment your hands are empty. He sat for a while looking at the valley. Then he called Dr. Vasquez's office. The scheduling coordinator answered on the second ring, and Caleb told her that the funding was in place and he needed to schedule Lila's surgery. There was a pause while the coordinator pulled up the calendar, and then she gave him a date in late May, 7 weeks away. And Caleb wrote it on the back of a gas station receipt that was in his cup holder because his phone's notes app required more steps than he wanted to deal with at that moment. He sat with the date written on the receipt in his hand. 7 weeks. He had been living around that surgery as an abstraction for 2.5 years, a fixed point in some future he was moving toward without being able to see it clearly. Now it had a date on it. It had a Tuesday in May with a specific time and a specific hospital and a specific surgical team that Dr. Vasquez had already coordinated with. The abstraction had collapsed into something concrete and near, and the feeling that produced was not entirely comfortable, because the thing that had held his life in tension for 2.5 years was about to resolve, and a person doesn't always know what shape they're in without the tension until the tension lifts. He drove the rest of the way up the mountain and pulled into the garage lot and sat in the truck for another minute. Then he got out. Lila was at the kitchen table when he came in, working on a school project about ecosystems. There were index cards spread across the entire surface and a poster board leaning against the chair beside her. She looked up when he came through the door. "You were gone a long time," she said. "I had things to do in the city." "Did the car sell?" He had told her the morning before that the meeting was happening. She had asked one question: "Is it going to the museum?" And when he said yes, she had gone back to her homework with the satisfied air of someone whose opinion has been vindicated. "It's sold," he said. She looked at him steadily. And I called Dr. Vasquez's office." He sat down across from her at the table. The index cards were everywhere: photosynthesis, decomposers, nitrogen cycle, food web. "They have a date, late May." Lila was quiet for a moment. She had a pencil in her hand and she set it down on the table, carefully, the way she handled things when she was thinking. "Is it the same surgery Dr. Vasquez always talked about?" she asked. "The same one." "And after?" "After your heart works the way it's supposed to work." She thought about this. She was 9 and she had been living with the knowledge of her own heart condition since she was old enough to understand what the doctors were saying, which was earlier than Caleb had wanted, but later than he had feared. She had developed, over those years, a particular relationship with the information. She neither dramatized it nor entirely ignored it, but carried it alongside herself the way certain children carry things, with a practicality that sometimes made Caleb's chest ache. "Will it hurt?" she asked. "For a little while, afterward. Then less. Then not at all." She looked at the table. Then she looked back at him. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay." With the same tone she used when he told her dinner was ready, or that it was time to leave for school. A tone that meant she had received the information and was processing it and would be fine. He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table with her index cards, and her poster board, and her composed, serious face, and felt the specific love of a parent for a child that has no adequate description, the kind that is partly pride and partly terror, and mostly just the bare fact of the person in front of you and your complete inability to imagine a world that doesn't have them in it. "You did it," she said. "We still have 7 weeks." "But you did the hard part." He thought about the hard parts: the auction lot in the Nevada desert, the first nights alone in the garage, the calls from Tanner, Marco arriving out of nowhere with his white hair and his careful hands and his 12 years of carrying a falsified record, Isabella and her briefcase and her folder of evidence she had kept for 3 years because she had a feeling. Gary Osei shimmering a quarter panel at 4 in the afternoon with the cold coming through the bay door. The engine catching on a December night with all of them standing around it saying nothing. "Some of it," he said. Marco left on a Saturday morning at the end of April, which arrived before Caleb was ready for it. He had known it was coming. Marco had a life in Italy, a retired life with a garden and a daughter in Milan, and a small consulting arrangement with an engineering school that had been waiting for him to return. But the knowing hadn't made the garage feel any less empty when he loaded the last of his things into the rental car. They shook hands in the lot. Marco held the handshake for a moment longer than the purely formal version requires. "The museum opens the installation in October," Marco said. "I'll come back for that." "I know. Bring Lila. She should see it. She'll want to read every word on that documentation panel." "Good." Marco looked at the garage. At the bay door open to the morning and the ordinary vehicles inside. A Jeep with a transmission problem, a Honda with a brake issue, the daily work of a working garage. His eyes moved over it without judgment. "This is a good place," he said. "What you've built here." "It's a garage." "It's more than that." Marco looked at him. "You know it's more than that." Caleb didn't argue the point. He knew what Marco meant, and he knew Marco was right, and arguing would have been the kind of deflection he was trying to get better at not doing. "Travel safe," Caleb said. Marco got in the car. He rolled the window down. "Caleb?" Caleb looked at him. "Thank you," Marco said, "for letting me finish it with you." Caleb stood in the lot and watched the car go down the mountain road until it disappeared around the curve and the sound of it faded into the general sound of the morning, which was wind and birds and the occasional vehicle on the road below. Then he went back into the garage and stood for a moment in the bay where the Rosso had been, looking at the empty space it had occupied. The concrete was oil-free. He and Marco had cleaned the floor the evening before, the way you clean a space that deserves the attention. The outline of where the car had sat was still faintly visible in the wear pattern of the concrete, the 4 tire contact marks, the shadow of the undercarriage clearance, a ghost of the car in the floor. He looked at it for a while. Then he got the Jeep into the lift and started on the transmission. Bosh. Isabella Romano called from Portland on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks later. Caleb was in the garage doing inventory, not from necessity, but from the habit of a man who manages anxiety through organization. And he picked up on the second ring. "Patricia got the final confirmation from the museum's legal team," she said. "The engineering record amendment is fully executed, published in the industry registry, permanent." A pause. "Your name, Marco's name, correct and complete." Caleb set down the clipboard. "When?" "This afternoon." He stood in the garage and looked at the space where the car had been. "Does Marco know?" "I called him first. He asked me to call you." "How was he?" "He didn't say much." Another pause. "He cried a little. He would be annoyed with me for telling you that." "I won't mention it. He knows you know anyway." Caleb could hear something in Isabella's voice that was not her usual precise professionalism, something softer underneath it. The layer that existed before the professional manner had been built up over it through years of navigating rooms where she had to be careful. "I want to say something, and I'm going to say it plainly, because I don't know another way." "Go ahead." "I spent 6 years trying to figure out what to do with the documentation I had. I knew what it meant. I knew what had been done. I didn't know how to act on it without the object itself, without the car existing and being completed and being what it was always supposed to be." She stopped for a moment. "You made it possible to act on it, you and Marco, but you started it. You bought that wreck when no one else saw what it was." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said what was true. "I almost didn't bid. I talked myself out of it twice while I was standing there." "But you bid." "Lila was there. She didn't say anything. She was watching me, and I didn't want to explain to her why I was walking away from something I recognized." Isabella was quiet for a moment. "That's a good reason," she said. "It's the honest one." After she hung up, Caleb stood in the garage for a long time. The evening light was coming through the west-facing window at a low angle, the kind of spring light that goes gold before it goes dark, and it lay across the concrete floor in a wide bar that crossed exactly the space where the Rosso had sat. He thought about what Isabella had said, and he thought about what he had said back, and he thought about the truth underneath both of those things, which was that the decisions that change the arc of a life rarely feel like significant decisions while you're making them. They feel like small decisions in ordinary moments. A bid at a salvage auction, a conversation with a 9-year-old in a garage doorway, a phone call not ended when it should have been ended, a corner cut not taken on a firewall specification 12 years ago. The significant thing isn't the decision. The significant thing is what you were paying attention to when you made it. Look, Lila's surgery was on a Tuesday in the last week of May, and Caleb sat in the surgical waiting room for 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was inside the window Dr. Vasquez had given him, and also the longest 4 hours and 20 minutes of his life, by a distance he couldn't have estimated in advance. He did not do anything useful during that time. He tried to read a magazine and didn't retain a word of it. He tried to organize his phone and accomplished nothing. He drank 2 cups of bad coffee and ate a granola bar from the vending machine that tasted like cardboard and sugar, and ate it anyway. He watched the other people in the waiting room, the other parents and spouses and adult children sitting with their own versions of this particular waiting, each of them carrying it in a slightly different posture, and felt the strange solidarity of strangers sharing a specific kind of fear. Marco had offered to fly back for the surgery. Caleb had told him not to, that it would be fine, and then had been grateful for the offer in a way that surprised him. Isabella had sent a text that morning that said only, "She's going to be fine," which was presumptuous of her to say, and also exactly what he needed to read. Dr. Vasquez came through the double doors at 12 minutes past noon. She was still in scrubs, which meant she had come directly from the OR, which meant it was over. Her face was the face of someone delivering information they expect to be received well, which was different from the face of someone delivering information they are uncertain about. "She's out," Dr. Vasquez said. "The procedure went as planned. No complications. She's in recovery." Caleb absorbed this. He had prepared himself for the words, but the words still required a moment to land fully. "Can I see her?" "In about 40 minutes. She'll be groggy." "I know." Dr. Vasquez looked at him. "She was very calm going in," she said. She asked one of the nurses if they'd ever worked on a racing car engine. The nurse said no. Lila said the heart and a racing engine have the same basic problem. Both of them have to keep running under pressure without overheating. She paused. "I don't know where she gets this stuff." "Her father's garage," Caleb said. 43 minutes later, he was allowed into the recovery room, and Lila was in the bed in a hospital gown with monitors attached and an IV in her arm, and her hair still in the braid that had been partially undone since the morning. And she looked small in the way children look small in hospital beds, which is a specific kind of small that has nothing to do with their actual size. Her eyes opened when he came in. They were slow and unfocused from the anesthesia, but they found him. "Hey," she said. Her voice was rough. "Hey." "Did it work?" "Dr. Vasquez says yes." She considered this for a moment with the deliberate effort of someone whose brain is operating through chemical fog. "Good," she said. He sat in the chair beside the bed and took her hand, the one without the IV, and held it, and she let him, which she did not always do at home because she was 9 and had opinions about hand-holding. But now she curled her fingers around his, and her eyes drifted closed again. He sat there and held her hand and listened to the monitors and did not think about anything in particular, which was perhaps the first time in 2.5 years that he had sat anywhere and genuinely not thought about anything in particular, and the feeling of it was so unfamiliar it took him several minutes to identify it as something close to peace. But the summer that followed was not simple. Recovery took longer than Lila wanted it to, because she was a child who had opinions about being made to rest, and the post-surgical restrictions on her activity produced a low-grade ongoing argument between them that was, Caleb recognized, completely ordinary. An ordinary argument about ordinary things, which was its own kind of landmark. The garage ran better, not spectacularly. It was a small operation in the Sierra Nevada foothills, and it would likely always be a small operation in the Sierra Nevada foothills, and Caleb had made his peace with that in the same way he had made his peace with other things that weren't what he'd originally planned. But the debt was gone, and the equipment was updated, and he hired a part-time mechanic named Dean, who was 24 and earnest and still learning, but learned fast, which was the quality that mattered most. He paid Marco what Marco was owed, which Marco accepted after 1 round of protest and 1 round of Caleb explaining that the protest had been heard and noted and rejected. He paid Gary Osei for the panel work, with enough extra to make the number reflect what the panels had actually been worth, and Gary received it with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman being told his work was understood. He paid Isabella's legal fees through Patricia Soane's office, and Isabella sent him a message afterward that said, "It was not work. It was unfinished business." He read this several times and understood what she meant, and thought she was right. In the first week of September, Lila came home from school with an assignment. She set her backpack down at the kitchen table and produced a worksheet titled, "What Does Your Family Do? Interview a Person You Admire." She put it on the table and looked at Caleb. "I picked you," she said. "I'm in the family. You're supposed to pick someone you admire. Those aren't the same requirement." He looked at the worksheet. "What do you need?" She pulled out her notebook, the same blue one, replaced twice in the past year but always the same kind, and opened it to a blank page. "I have to ask you questions and write down what you say. What do you do for work?" "I fix cars." "What does that mean? Like, explain it more." Caleb thought about this. "It means people bring me machines that aren't working the way they're supposed to, and I figure out what's wrong, and I fix it." She wrote this down. "Is it hard?" "Sometimes." "What's the hardest part?" He thought about it genuinely, which he always tried to do when she asked him things. "Knowing the difference between something that's broken and something that's unfinished," he said. "Sometimes something looks completely beyond fixing, and it isn't. It just hasn't been given what it needs yet." Lila wrote this down slowly, making sure she got the words right. "Is that what the car was?" "Which car?" She gave him the look she gave him when he said something she considered unnecessary. "You know which car." "Yes," he said. "That's what the car was." She wrote for another moment, then she looked up. "Did you know it could be fixed when you bought it?" Caleb thought about the Nevada salvage lot, the hangar with the bad lighting, the dealers and collectors moving through the rows of inventory with their practiced disinterest, the covered wreck in the far corner that everyone else had walked past, and the moment he'd lifted the corner of the tarpaulin and seen the frame rail and known, not hoped, known, that the thing underneath was still fundamentally intact. "I thought it could be," he said. "I wasn't certain." "But you bought it anyway." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, the daughter with the notebook and the braid and the heart that now worked correctly in her chest, that now did without effort the thing it had been struggling to do for 9 years. The daughter who had stood in a garage doorway with a piece of toast and said the car looked less sad, who had told a museum curator that a heart and a racing engine had the same basic problem, who had waited in a recovery room bed and asked first thing if it worked. "Because some things are worth finishing," he said, "even when you're not sure you can, even when you're doing it mostly alone, even when it would be easier to walk away." He paused. "Especially then, maybe." Lila looked at him for a moment, then she wrote this down in her notebook, word by word, taking her time. When she was done, she read it back to herself quietly, checking it. Then she closed the notebook and looked up. "I think that's enough," she said. Caleb looked at her. "For the assignment?" "For everything," she said, with the calm certainty of a child who occasionally understands things more completely than the adults around her, and went to put her notebook in her backpack. He sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the September evening, with the garage light still on through the window, and the sound of the pines outside, and his daughter moving around the house behind him, and thought about patience as a form of stubbornness, and integrity as a form of self-preservation, and how the things that are worth finishing rarely announce themselves as such at the beginning. They just sit there, under a tarpaulin, in the back of a salvage lot, waiting for the one person who looks at them and sees not what they are, but what they were always supposed to become. Bomb. This story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are the product of imagination and bear no relation to real persons, living or dead, or actual events.